Sunset was slowly sinking over the quiet suburb, casting a soft orange light over the streets. Lisa, a 12-year-old girl, sat in her wheelchair on the veranda, clutching the teddy bear that had always been with her in times of need. Her dark, sparkling eyes looked out at the sidewalk in front of the house where her father was fixing her younger brother's bicycle. It seemed like it was going to be an ordinary evening, another day in the line of their routine. But at that moment, they didn't know that this idyll was about to be shattered. "Daddy, let's go for a walk." Lisa's voice, tinkling and filled with joy, cut through the silence. She loved evening walks, especially when the city calmed down after the day's hustle and bustle. Her father, an FBI agent, always made sure to make time for his family despite his busy job. He smiled, setting the tool aside. "Okay, sunshine, just put your hat on. It's chilly outside." Mom stepped out onto the porch, watching them, her face lit up with a gentle smile. Lisa cheered her brother up, promising that she would be back soon. Her father carefully wheeled the wheelchair out the gate, habitually making sure the wheels didn't get stuck in the cracks of the sidewalk. For Lisa, walking was not only a way to see the world outside the house, but also a small victory over the circumstances that constrained her body. Everything was going quietly. Lisa smiled as she watched the evening lights twinkling in the windows of the neighboring houses. She told her father about her dreams. "Daddy, I want to see the ocean one day. Huge, huge, like in those movies we used to watch." His heart squeezed. He knew she saw the world differently, but he had always believed that her fortitude could overcome anything. And then, around the corner, a sharp sound broke the silence. Lisa saw her father's face tense. A white-skinned policeman appeared, accompanied by a large service dog. Her father habitually covered Lisa as if protecting her with his shadow. The policeman approached slowly, his gaze wary. The service dog tightened its leash, emitting a threatening growl. "It's okay, Lisa," her father said in a soothing voice, but she felt his hand shake slightly. The policeman stopped a few paces away, looking around them tensely, as if he was searching for something. "Is something wrong, officer?" Dad's voice sounded calm, but there was a hint of anxiety in it. "A disturbance? Someone making a mess in here?" The policeman tossed sharply, his gaze lingering on Lisa in her wheelchair. He seemed surprised by their presence. Lisa felt the dog make a jerk coming toward her. Her small hand squeezed the teddy bear even tighter. Anxiety was slowly being replaced by fear. "We're just taking a walk," the father said firmly, stepping forward, covering his daughter. But the policeman didn't even try to hide his disbelief, and the dog continued to growl, the leash tighter. The tension in the air was becoming unbearable. And then it all happened in an instant. The dog lunged forward. The policeman lost control of the leash. Lisa screamed. Her wheelchair wobbled. Her father rushed forward. But it was too late. Lisa screamed as the huge service dog lunged forward, its massive paws knocking the delicate balance of the wheelchair out of control. Everything around her suddenly became noisy, blurry, as if the world tilted, ready to collapse. The girl clutched at the armrests, but her weak arms couldn't keep her balance. The wheelchair wobbled, and her father rushed forward, trying to protect her. "Hold your dog!" he shouted, his voice firm but filled with despair. The policeman stood as if frozen, his face frozen in a cold mixture of indifference and annoyance. "She's just scaring him, that's all," he muttered, not even making an attempt to take control of the situation. There was contempt in his voice, as if seeing Lisa and her father were just a nuisance. The dog growled, its teeth bared. It circled around Lisa, barking viciously, and each tug of the leash brought it closer to the girl. Lisa tried to hold back tears, her eyes wide with terror. Her wheelchair tilted sideways, one of the wheels on the verge of falling off. "Get her away from my daughter!" The father shouted louder, his voice piercing the air, but the policeman only shrugged. "Don't act aggressive or she'll feel it, and it'll only get worse," he said with a tone as if he was blaming the father for what was happening. "She's in a wheelchair, for fuck's sake. She's a child." Her father's voice became low, like a growl, a mixture of rage and helplessness. Lisa looked up at him, her gaze saying, "Please do something." But her father knew that any careless movement could only make the situation worse. The policeman stepped closer, his face hard now, his eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, buddy," he threw, his hand slowly reaching for the belt where the baton hung. The gesture was threatening, deliberate. Lisa squirmed, her small hands clutching the teddy bear tightly. She could feel the fear seeping into every cell of her body, and the smell of tension lingered in the air. My father realized that his words were no longer going to help. He took a step toward Lisa, blocking the dog's path. But this movement only provoked the animal. The dog lunged forward, its mouth open, revealing sharp teeth. The father raised his hands to cover himself and Lisa, but it was a moment of terror. The dog jumped right onto the wheelchair. A rumble. Lisa slid to the side, her wheelchair tipping over. Her thin, fragile voice came out like a silent scream. Her father managed to grab her in his arms, his face twisted with pain and anger, but the dog continued to attack, its teeth grasping everything in its path. "You let this happen." "She's a child, damn it," he shouted toward the policeman, his voice hoarse, broken. But the policeman didn't move. He merely watched the chaos, as if it was just an unpleasant incident that didn't deserve his attention. For a moment, he grinned. Does she have a brain problem? Maybe she's just scared of loud noises? He squeezed out, his words imbued with cold, expectant contempt. The phrase struck my father like lightning. His hands clenched into fists. He lifted Lisa, who was now trembling all over, her body hanging helplessly in his arms. "You will answer for this," he said quietly, his voice no longer loud. There was such icy determination in that tone that even the policeman felt uneasy. The dog finally calmed down when the father took a few steps back. The policeman, as if awake, pulled on the leash. "That's it. It's no big deal," he muttered, as if the attack on the child in the wheelchair could be written off as a mere nuisance. Dad didn't answer. He just watched the man turn and walk away, leading his dog away. But there was a spark of anger in his eyes, the kind of anger that would not go away until justice was done. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether something similar has happened in your life. It's important for us to hear your opinions and experiences. If you are interested in our stories, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new chapters. And now we continue. Lisa screamed. Her voice was thin, almost silent, but it was everything. Pain, terror, pleading for help. She tried to take refuge in her wheelchair, but where to run when her only shelter was vulnerable? The huge dog lunged forward, snarls merging with hoarse breathing and its eyes burning with aggression. Lisa, clutching her teddy bear, leaned back helplessly, her body paralyzed with fear. "Stop! Pull her away!" the father shouted again, his voice full of desperation. He tried to shield Lisa with his body, but each time the dog found a loophole to lunge at the girl in the wheelchair again. The father couldn't throw the dog away because he was afraid of hurting Lisa. The policeman was still standing still. He held the leash, but only symbolically. He didn't even seem to be trying to stop what was happening. His face expressed a mixture of annoyance and boredom, as if he were an audience member in a theater playing an overdrawn scene. "She was just scared. It's nothing. Calm down," he said lazily, as if the girl's screams and the chaos around him didn't concern him. "No big deal. You're killing my daughter." The father turned toward him, but immediately had to turn back in time to grab the wheelchair, which skidded on the sidewalk from the dog's jerks. "She's a child. She can't defend herself. Do something." The policeman rolled his eyes, and there was a hint of irritation in his tone. "Why didn't you teach her to be calm?" "The dog senses fear." Those words stabbed at my heart like a blade. My father froze for a second, then looked at the policeman with such fury that even he backed away slightly. The dog lunged forward and grabbed the teddy bear Lisa was holding on her chest. It yanked the toy with such force that Lisa almost fell out of her wheelchair. The girl was crying, her little hands shaking as she tried to hold on. Her face was flooded with tears, her lips trembled, but she couldn't say anything. It seemed that words would no longer help. "Damn it, you didn't even apologize," the father shouted, clutching the handles of the wheelchair to keep it from tipping over. The policeman only snorted. "She's just a dog doing her thing," he threw coldly. That answer seemed to cut off the flow of air around him. Lisa's mom ran out of the house, her scream piercing the air. "What's going on here? Why didn't you stop her?" She rushed toward her husband and daughter, but the dog tore forward again, growling deafeningly. The policeman, as if in slow motion, reached for the leash, but too late. The dog's teeth slid down the armrest of the wheelchair, leaving deep marks, and then approached Lisa. The girl was helpless. She could only cuddle up to her father, trying to hide behind his broad shoulders. But even that was not enough. "You're just standing there." Dad lunged forward, his voice low, almost tearing with anger. The policeman finally yanked the leash harder, his face indifferent. "If you'd just stayed home, this wouldn't have happened." He threw a wink at Lisa's mom, adding a venomous sneer to his words. Mom stopped, her face twisted with rage. "What did you say? We don't have the right to walk? We're not like you? Is that all you see of my family?" The policeman shrugged but remained silent. His dog finally stood quietly, but his body still trembled with tension. Lisa wasn't crying anymore. She just stared at herself, her small shoulders shaking with cold or shock. Her wheelchair, mangled by the dog's teeth, seemed a symbol of her helplessness. "We won't just leave it at that," the father said quietly, lifting his daughter into his arms. His voice was hard as stone. The policeman smiled mockingly, but a shadow of worry flickered in his eyes. That encounter changed everything. The silence that followed was even more eerie than the screams. But it was not the silence of the end, but the silence before the storm. Lisa could hardly breathe, her frail body shaking in the wheelchair. Her head hung helplessly to the side, her hands still clutching the armrests. The baby bear she held so tightly was lying on the ground, its soft fabric torn by the dog's teeth. The girl's eyes, once full of life and dreams, were dull and wandering, as if she could no longer find a foothold in the world. "Lisa, hold on, honey, hold on." Her father's voice broke the silence of the street filled with evening shadows. His hands shook as he tried to bring her to her senses. He repeated her name several times, but she no longer responded. Her body was still in the wheelchair, but it seemed her soul was already sliding away. Mom dropped to her knees beside her, her hands shaking Lisa as if that would bring her back to life. "Lisa, honey, open your eyes. Open your eyes, please." Her voice turned into a croak filled with despair. Her footprints remained on the asphalt, the footprints of a mother ready to scratch out the whole world to save her daughter. The policeman was still standing nearby, his arms folded across his chest. His face expressed something between boredom and annoyance, as if he were just waiting for this scene to end. "She looks weak," he threw in, as if it were a diagnostic opinion rather than a tragedy. His voice, cold and detached, cut through the air like a knife. "What did you say?" Father jumped up, his face pale but his eyes blazing with anger. "You let this happen. You stood by and watched that thing kill my daughter." His fists clenched, but he still held himself together, trying to focus on Lisa. His heart was tearing apart because he knew time was running out. Mom couldn't hold back her tears. She wrapped her arms around Lisa, pulling her close to her, her cry echoing through the empty streets. "God, do something, I beg you." She begged her husband, pleaded with the sky, but no one came to help. Only the wind quietly ruffled her hair and the leaves rustled on the road, as if nature, too, had frozen in helplessness. The policeman only hummed. "If you had gotten out of the way right away, this wouldn't have happened," he said, as if he were putting a stop to the argument. His words were so cold that Lisa's mother turned toward him, her face tear-stained but her gaze as sharp as a blade. "You're a monster," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it felt the force of all her hatred. The policeman only shrugged, as if he was bored with the whole thing. His dog sat beside him, breathing tiredly, as if it had nothing to do with him. Lisa quietly let out a sound like a sigh, and at that moment everyone froze. Her hands loosened, and the teddy bear fell at her father's feet. Her eyes remained open, but the light in them went out. She was no longer breathing. "No, no, Lisa, Lisa!" The father's scream rang through the street. He fell to his knees in front of his daughter, wrapping his arms around her small, lifeless body, still strapped to the wheelchair. His hands shook as he stroked her hair, repeating her name over and over like a prayer. But there was no more answer. Lisa's mother screamed loudly, her voice filling the evening air as if she were trying to tear up the sky, begging for her daughter's return. She hugged Lisa's body, her arms clenched so tightly, as if she feared that even in death her child might disappear. The policeman finally stepped closer, looking around lazily at what was going on. "I'll call an ambulance," he said nonchalantly, pulling out a walkie-talkie. His voice was as indifferent as before, like he was ordering a food delivery. There wasn't an ounce of regret in his gaze, just a slight annoyance that the situation had dragged on. Father turned around abruptly, his eyes burning with anger. You killed her." His voice trembled, but it held a rage capable of sweeping away mountains. The policeman retreated a step, but then regained his swagger. "It was an accident. You do realize that, don't you? Her condition, it was like that from the beginning, wasn't it?" Those words were the final blow. Lisa's mother collapsed to the ground, screaming in soundless hysterics, and her father rose, his fists clenched to white. In that moment, he vowed that this tragedy would not go unnoticed. But Lisa heard no more cries or promises. Her life was cut short the very night that indifference, racism, and cruelty decided her fate. A policeman stood nearby, head tilted casually, watching a family weeping over the body of a girl in her mangled wheelchair. It seemed to him that it would all be over soon. A call to the ambulance, a few protocols, and he would go home to avoid thinking about the unpleasant shift. But everything changed the moment his father looked up and said quietly but clearly, "You have no idea what you've done." The words sounded threatening, but something in them made the policeman tense. He turned away, trying not to meet the eyes of the man whose daughter had died because of his inaction. Again, he took a step back, but suddenly he heard Lisa's mother whisper hatefully, "You killed the daughter of a federal agent. You're going to regret coming here at all." The policeman froze. His face, hitherto calm, tensed as if from a blow. "What? What did you say?" he said, trying to maintain indifference, but his voice betrayed his confusion. Lisa's father stood up, his figure towering over him, eyes blazing with anger. "I'm an FBI agent, and my daughter is dead because of your helplessness. You killed a child in a wheelchair. Do you realize that?" The policeman suddenly felt cold sweat running down his back. His palms moistened, and he nervously adjusted his belt, trying to keep his composure. "Look, I was just doing my job," he began, but the words stuck in his throat. The thoughts were already pounding in his head. "Shit, this is bad, really bad. The FBI. This isn't just a family. This is not a case that can be hushed up." He cast a glance at the dog, as if trying to justify himself by her presence. "She was just reacting to a threat, wasn't she?" "I couldn't have known." The policeman stammered, looking at Lisa's body in the wheelchair. She was very small, fragile, and her teddy bear lay at her father's feet. That scene didn't leave him alone now. "A threat? You call a girl in a wheelchair a threat? You didn't even try to protect her." The father's voice was as loud as a gunshot. The policeman took another step back, as if those words might knock him down. His heart was pounding, his thoughts confused. He looked around. The street was empty, but he felt like he was being watched from every window. Every passerby could hear what he had done. No, it's not my fault," he whispered to himself. "They were provoking. They were yelling. I didn't have to." But even in his head, he sounded unconvinced. Soon, colleagues arrived. The cops surveyed the scene discreetly, but when one of them heard that the father was an FBI agent, the atmosphere changed dramatically. "You're in serious trouble," his partner said quietly as they took a few steps away. "It's not my fault," he repeated over and over, trying to convince not only his partner but himself as well. They looked suspicious. They were yelling. The dog sensed aggression. But even his partner looked at him questioningly. "She was in a wheelchair, Jim. Do you realize what that means?" The words wheelchair cut his hearing. He remembered how the dog had growled at the little girl, how she had fallen, how the parents had screamed, but he had stood there doing nothing. Suddenly, he realized this was no longer just a violation, it was a catastrophe. "What do I do now?" he asked quietly, feeling for the first time that the situation was beyond his control. His partner sighed, trying to distance himself from what was happening. "Pray that by some miracle you get away with it. But honestly, you've already lost." Jim felt his legs go absorbent cotton. His career, his life, everything was crumbling right in front of him. He looked at Lisa's family. The mother was still crying. The father was silent, but his gaze was determined. It was the look of a man who wouldn't stop until he got justice. The policeman took another step back, retreating into the shadows, but the shadows could no longer hide him. All his confidence, his indifference, had evaporated. He knew now that every excuse he made, every attempt to absolve himself of responsibility, was empty words. The truth was that he had stood by, watched, and done nothing, and Lisa, sitting in her wheelchair, had died because of his inaction. The police radio wheezed, and the street was filled with the sound of sirens and the rumble of approaching cars. Several officers, like shadows, quickly took up positions, outlining the scene. But something wasn't right. This didn't look like an investigation. It resembled a cleanup, as if they were in a hurry to erase traces of what had really happened. Lisa's father stood over his daughter's body, his hands shaking and fury burning in his eyes. He looked carefully at each arriving officer, memorizing faces, but none of them dared to meet his gaze. They scanned the place hastily, avoiding any conversation. "It's too quiet," he thought. "Silence always precedes something messy." "Gather all the evidence," came the commanding voice of one of the officers. But there was something odd about the way he said it. Instead of the usual meticulousness of the investigation, they acted as if they already knew how it was going to end. One of them walked up to the policeman with the dog and said, "Jim, don't worry. We'll take care of it." "Settle?" Lisa's father stepped forward, his voice sounding like a gunshot. "My daughter is dead. Are you talking about settling this?" The officer froze, but quickly pulled himself together. "We'll handle it, sir. You'd better calm down." Those words were cold, empty. They meant nothing. Lisa's mother was still sitting on the ground, hugging her daughter's lifeless body in the wheelchair. Her tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she raised her head and said quietly, "Do you want to blame us? To say it's our fault? But we didn't do anything." Her words sounded like a challenge that none of the police officers wanted to accept. The dog felt threatened. Jim, the cop with the dog, finally spoke. His voice was weak, but there was still a shadow of vindication in it. "You were acting aggressively. If you had just followed directions—" "Directions?" Lisa's father stepped closer, his face contorted with anger. "What indication can justify the death of a child in a wheelchair? How can you stand here and lie to my face?" But Jim did not answer. At that moment, one of the senior officers stepped forward, laying a hand on Jim's shoulder. "We'll make a report," he said, his voice almost friendly. "But you'd better go home. It's important for you to have time to recover now." Lisa's father realized what was going on. They were trying to delay time, to create a story that would absolve them of responsibility. He knew those methods all too well. How many times in his career had he seen situations like this turn into victim blaming, into misrepresentation, into reports where every paragraph hid the truth? "No," he said firmly. "I'm not leaving until there's an honest investigation." His voice was like stone, unmoving and unbroken. But the senior officer only sighed. "You must realize that this was an accident, and if you continue it could reflect badly on your family." The officer's words sounded like a threat, but Lisa's father didn't flinch. "You think you can keep this quiet? You killed my daughter. You think I'm going to let you get away with it?" His voice grew louder and louder, but the officers around him just looked away. They had already decided that the truth in this case was just an obstacle. The next day, a new wave began. The police issued a statement emphasizing that Lisa's family had allegedly behaved provocatively and that the service dog had acted under threat. The phrase "wheelchair" was mentioned in passing, as a detail that no one considered important. The local news was quick to pick up the story. Headlines screamed, "Police officer's dog reacted to aggression." Lisa's father, seeing this, clenched his fist so hard that his nails dug into his skin. It wasn't just a punch, it was a lie, cynical and cruel. He started collecting evidence, surveillance cameras, witness tapes, anything that could show the true picture. He knew the system wouldn't be on his side. He knew it would be a fight to the death. But he also knew that justice for Lisa was the only thing worth continuing for. Now, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a battlefield. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether something similar has happened in your life. It's important for us to hear your thoughts and experiences. If you find these stories interesting, subscribe so you don't miss new chapters. And now, we continue. Lisa's father sat in the dark room, holding his daughter's teddy bear. His fingers clutched the soft fabric tightly, as if it were the last link to his child that he couldn't let go. The events of that cursed evening replayed over and over in his mind. He'd seen her terrified eyes, heard her weak screams, felt her trembling body in her wheelchair as the dog had come down on her with a fury that no one had stopped. It was too much. Lisa wasn't coming back, and he knew it. But her death would not be in vain. He looked up and saw his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was not the same man he'd been just a few days ago. Lisa had changed him. Her death had displaced everything else, leaving only one thing: rage. Rage at the indifference of the system, at those who tried to turn her murder into a mere accident, and at those who dared to think it could be hushed up. He took his first steps that same night. His colleagues at the FBI heard what had happened almost immediately. Many expressed sympathy, but they were just words, empty promises of support that meant nothing. He realized this when he began to demand an investigation. He was politely but firmly given to understand that it would be difficult to interfere in the internal affairs of the local police, that the case was already framed as an incident involving a service dog. The justification was on paper, and no one wanted to rewrite history. But he wasn't ready to stop. Lisa's father knew that the truth was the only thing that could break through this wall of lies and indifference. He started with a surveillance camera mounted on a neighboring building. He personally found the owner, convinced him to release the footage. The footage was clear. Lisa, a little girl in her wheelchair, was completely helpless as the dog pounced on her. A police officer stood by, watching as the attack unfolded. The time, the place, the faces, it was all on the record. It was the truth, and it was undeniable. When he tried to forward the footage to the local police department, he was met with a cold reception. "We've already done our investigation, sir," the station chief replied to him without even looking at the video. "Nothing will change." Those words ignited his anger even more. It wasn't just ignoring, it was defending a system that allowed racism and brutality to flourish. His daughter wasn't the first victim, and if he did nothing, she wouldn't be the last. He went further, spreading the video through the media. However, even here he encountered obstacles. Several major publications refused to publish the material, citing that the story was too sensitive and their editorial offices did not want to clash with the police. But he didn't give up. He found independent journalists who agreed to show the footage. The story began to spread, causing resonance in the local community. But along with that came a new wave of pressure. He began to be summoned to the FBI for conversations, gently reminding him that his actions could jeopardize his career. He was hinted that perhaps he should focus on his personal pain, rather than making a scandal out of it. "It won't help you get your daughter back," one executive told him. Those words sounded like a punch in the face. as if someone was trying to erase Lisa from his memory, to make him resign himself to it. But he couldn't resign himself to it. He couldn't forget that the system he'd served his whole life was now on the side of his child's killers. One night, he discovered that someone was trying to break into his house. The door had been forced open and his laptop was upside down on the table. Nothing was missing, but it was clear to him. This was a warning. He called his old friends at the FBI who were still on his side. They confirmed that he was being followed. The police system felt threatened, and now it was trying to intimidate him. But that only strengthened his resolve. He organized a meeting with a group of activists who had long fought racism in the local police force. Their stories of injustice, of broken families and lives, became his fuel. He promised that Lisa's case would be the beginning of the end for this system. Together, they began organizing protests, demanding investigations and gaining federal attention. Meanwhile, the local police continued to defend themselves. They released a new report claiming that Lisa's family had allegedly disobeyed the officer's instructions, that it was their actions that provoked the dog. They tried to portray Lisa as a threat, despite the fact that she was a girl in a wheelchair. It was a dirty lie, but it resonated with some. Racism, like a poisonous root, was deeply woven into the fabric of society, and Lisa's father knew it. He fought not only for his daughter, but for every family that faced it. Every night he was sleepless. He spent hours looking at records, rereading documents, searching for new leads. He was no longer just an FBI agent. He was a father whose daughter had died because of a system that was supposed to protect. He had nothing to lose but the memory of Lisa, and he knew he wouldn't stop until that memory became a symbol of the fight for justice. The silence of the street was deceptive. It concealed the storm that had already erupted in the hearts of the people who had learned of Lisa's murder, a little girl in a wheelchair. Lisa's death had not just hurt her family. It had exposed the rottenness of a system based on bias, where skin color determined who was trusted and who was considered guilty a priori. The first headlines that appeared on the local news were infuriating. Service dog protected officer from potential threat. Family behaved aggressively. Words that diligently blurred the lines of responsibility. Lisa, in a wheelchair, defenseless and innocent, suddenly became the aggressor in these reports. Not a word about the fact that she was a black girl who needed to protect her, not attack her. It was a standard tactic: blame the victim and gloss over the truth. Lisa's father, sitting in his office, looked at these articles with an anger that boiled up inside. These were not just lies. This was an insult to his daughter even after her death. Her blood had yet to run cold, and the system was already feverishly trying to vindicate her. He knew that the cause was not simple negligence, not a mistake. The reason lay in the way this family had been seen from the beginning: black, unacceptable, secondary. He remembered the way Officer Jim had looked at them that night, his gaze filled with contempt, even as Lisa was dying in her wheelchair. It wasn't the look of a man who saw them as human beings. It was a look that saw a threat, a problem, anything but human lives. And this gaze was not unique. It was the gaze of a system that had been sustained by generations of bias and discrimination. When the surveillance footage began circulating on social media, it sparked a furious response. The footage showed everything. Jim standing with an indifferent face as his dog tears into a girl in a wheelchair, her screams, her parents' attempts to protect her, and the officer's complete inaction. The video was undeniable evidence, but instead of shocking the public, It divided people into two camps. Some saw it as a clear case of police brutality and racism. How can you call this defense? She was a child in a wheelchair. What could she do? They wrote in the comments. Others, on the other hand, tried to justify the police action. If the family really did not obey the instructions, then it's their fault, sounded in different words, and some even claimed that it was their own fault for going out on the street. The protests began within days. People gathered outside Lisa's family home holding placards with her picture on them that read, "Her life was important," and "Justice for Lisa." The streets were filled with shouts demanding change, but the protests were followed by counter-protests. A group of people supporting the police showed up with slogans such as, "Don't make it harder for the police," and "They are doing everything to protect us." On television, they started talking about it even louder. One popular anchor, known for his conservative views, allowed himself to say, "Maybe we should be asking why the family failed to control their child. Sometimes the system makes mistakes, but let's not forget that officers face threats every day." His words sparked a wave of support among his audience, but for Lisa's father, it was the last straw. He took part in a talk show despite warnings from his colleagues that it might make his situation worse. He wasn't about to stay silent. "My daughter was not a threat. She was a child in a wheelchair, and the system that was supposed to protect her let her die. If you think that's okay, then you're part of that system too." His voice was firm, but there was a pain in it that couldn't be disbelieved. His words went viral, spreading across the internet. The police tried to defend themselves. Jim gave an interview in which he repeated the same thing. "I was just doing my job. I couldn't have known it would end like this." But his voice was weak, his eyes were running, and everyone could see the fear in that. Fear for the truth already starting to seep out. Lisa's father didn't stop there. He found other cases where police actions had led to the deaths of innocent people. Each of them told the same story. People died because they didn't fit the system's idea of safe and valuable. It was a war, and he was willing to fight it, even if it cost him everything. Protests began to grow. People shouted Lisa's name in the streets. Her pictures appeared on posters all over the country. But with it came a new wave of hatred. He started receiving threats. Someone even wrote on the wall of his house, "You'll get nowhere." But he wasn't afraid. His daughter deserved more than empty promises and fake apologies. It wasn't just about Lisa anymore. It was about every child whose life could have been cut short just as easily. It was a fight for the truth that no one could stop. The courtroom was filled with a silence in which the weight of everyone's breath was felt. The people filling the rows of benches seemed afraid to move, lest they break the fragile line between what was happening inside the building and the simmering protests outside. Loud cries of "Justice for Lisa" echoed through the thick walls, reminding everyone that this trial had already gone beyond a routine case. This was more than the trial of a single police officer. It was a battle for the life of a girl who had been killed by the system, for the truth that was trying to be drowned in false reports. Lisa's family entered the hall in silence. The father, dressed in a strict dark suit, walked with a firm posture, but his eyes betrayed the pain that would never leave him. Lisa's mother clung to his arm, her face pale but determined. They were ready to fight, but they knew they had an uphill battle ahead of them. The system would not give up without a fight. Policeman Jim was already seated at the defense table, accompanied by lawyers provided by the police union. His face was tense and his arms were crossed, as if he were trying to defend himself as well as the court. His lawyer, a man with a cold stare and a clear speech, was already preparing to speak. He was a professional, accustomed to defending the police at all costs, and he had one task: to make everyone forget that Lisa had once been a girl sitting in her wheelchair. The prosecutor opened the case by presenting surveillance footage. The video flashed on the screen. Lisa, small, defenseless, sitting in her wheelchair as the dog tore at her. Whispers and muffled exclamations of horror were heard in the audience, but a defense attorney jumped up from his seat, demanding that the footage be expunged. "This footage does not reflect the entire situation," he declared with a determination that could have been mistaken for certainty. But Lisa's father stood up. His voice came through firm and loud. "All that needs to be seen is how your system allowed my daughter to die." The judge allowed the video to be shown, but it was already clear that every attempt to reveal the truth would be met with resistance. Then began the defense's attempts to shift the blame to Lisa's parents. They claimed that the family was emotionally unstable, that their behavior provoked the dog. There was an undercurrent of contempt in their words. People like that always cause trouble. The father gritted his teeth as he heard the lawyer describe his daughter. She probably screamed and frightened the animal. Ultimately, her actions led to the tragedy. The lawyer sounded off. Lisa, a little girl in a wheelchair, had suddenly become a threat. Lisa's mother cried as she listened to this. She couldn't stand it and screamed, "She was a child who could do nothing." The judge asked for silence, but the hall was already seething. People outside the building learned of the lawyer's words, and the protests grew even louder. Jim took the stand to testify. His voice was uncertain, but he tried to stick to the line of defense. "I did the best I could," he began. "The situation was moving too fast. The dog felt threatened, and I just didn't have time to react." But then the prosecutor asked a question that punched a hole in his defense. "What exactly was the threat to you?" "A little girl in a wheelchair." Jim hesitated. He knew that answering that question could have cost him everything, but his lawyer quickly intervened, objecting that the question was aimed at emotional pressure. The judge granted the objection, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. When it was Lisa's father's turn to testify, he rose from his seat, his figure like granite, firm but exuding pain. "My daughter never threatened anyone. She was the kindest person I knew. But that night, the system decided her life was worthless. This man stood there and watched the dog attack her. He didn't even try to stop her." His voice shook, but his words sounded like a hammer breaking ice. The defense attorney tried to humiliate him. "You are probably too emotional to assess the situation objectively. As an FBI agent yourself, you know that action must be swift in such cases." But Lisa's father didn't waver. "I know one thing. My daughter died because he did nothing, and you're trying to justify it now." The trial lasted several weeks. The defense did everything it could to divert attention from the key facts, including insisting that the incident had no racial overtones. But the prosecutor presented evidence that could not be ignored. Statistics showing that similar incidents involving service dogs are more likely to happen to black families. Jim and his colleagues were part of a system that had operated with bias for centuries. When the day of the verdict came, the hall was filled with people. Lisa's parents were holding hands, preparing to hear the verdict. The judge entered, and silence filled the room. The verdict read, "Guilty." Jim was found guilty of negligence resulting in the death of a child, but the joy was bitter. Lisa's father knew that this victory was only the beginning. Lisa would never come back, but her death was the light that illuminated the darkness of a system that demanded change. Warm sunlight flooded the street where the bronze monument to Lisa stood now, a little girl in a wheelchair, with a smile that her parents had seen so often, and a teddy bear clutched to her chest. It seemed that the very ground around the monument breathed the memory of that tragedy, which changed the fates of thousands of people. But the silence that reigned around was deceptive. This place became not only a symbol of grief, but also a battlefield for justice, which for so long had bypassed those who lived under the burden of prejudice and injustice. After the trial and sentencing, it seemed to Jim that the story was finally over. But Lisa's parents knew. This was only the beginning. They saw the system start to come together again, trying to erase their daughter's memory in order to maintain their power. And they decided they would never allow it. They had to turn their grief into strength, and their daughter into a symbol of the movement for truth. The protests that began on the day of Lisa's death did not subside but grew louder. People of all ages and races filled the streets with placards bearing the words, "Her life mattered," "Justice for Lisa," and "Break the chains of the system." They demanded change, not just the conviction of one police officer, but reforms that could prevent such tragedies in the future. Among the protesters were many children and teens with disabilities who saw themselves in Lisa. "She was one of us," said one boy sitting in his wheelchair, his voice echoing into the microphone at the rally, which drew thousands of people. But the system fought back. Police unions, conservative politicians, and the media supporting the status quo launched their counterattack. They argued that Lisa's case was an exception, that her death was not due to racism or bias. One prominent televangelist said on air, "We cannot allow an isolated incident to destroy the credibility of our valiant officers. They protect us every day." His words drew a flurry of criticism, but also support from those who still clung to the old order. Lisa's parents did not waver. They knew the fight for change would be long and fierce. They began working with activists, lawyers, and politicians who supported their movement. Together, they drafted Lisa's Law, a reform package that included strict controls on the use of service dogs, mandatory training for officers to work with people with disabilities, and stricter liability measures for cases of negligence. The law was submitted to the local legislature, but even there it faced resistance. Why should we change the system for the sake of one case? Voices of opposition were heard. It will create unnecessary pressure on the officers. These words cut to the heart of Lisa's parents. One senator even said such reforms could weaken police power and lead to anarchy. But every time they heard such statements, they responded with one thing: "My daughter was murdered. It was not an accident, it was bias. And if we don't change the system, it will happen again." It took months before the law was finally passed, only after many protests and public pressure. But its passage was only part of the victory. Lisa's story continued to inspire people. Her name became synonymous with fighting injustice. Foundations set up in her honor helped families who had suffered from police brutality. Her parents became the faces of the reform movement, speaking at conferences, rallies, and schools to spread the word about the importance of not remaining silent in the face of injustice. But the hatred and racism that killed Lisa didn't go away. The family received threats. Their house was sprayed with graffiti that read, "Get out." One night, a rock smashed her room window, but they didn't give up. They knew Lisa wouldn't want them to stop. Her life had been short, but her legacy was eternal. Over time, even those who initially resisted change began to recognize that Lisa's story had changed the country. Her monument became a place of pilgrimage for those searching for hope. People left letters, flowers, toys, and their stories of loss, injustice, and hope for a better future. Every morning, Lisa's mother came to the monument to read those letters. "You changed the world, sweetheart," she whispered, holding a teddy bear in her hands. This story has become more than one girl in a wheelchair killed by the system. It became a movement, a symbol that one life could light a fire that would illuminate the path to justice. And while that fire burned, Lisa's memory lived on. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? It is important for us to know your opinions and experiences, because every word from you is valuable to us. We sincerely appreciate each and every one of you and your support. If you like this story, subscribe to our channel and give us a like so you don't miss new episodes. We wish you a good day and peace in your soul.